Please remember to stay on mute unless you are asking a question. My name is Cain, and I'm the Vice President of LISC and the Director of Rural LISC, an organization committed to rural investment and small business growth. Rural LISC is part of LISC. We are actually one of the country's largest CDFIs. Rural LISC started over 25 years ago, and over the course of that time, we've grown significantly and now embrace a network of over 150 partners, including 50 business development organizations, directly supporting small businesses in rural communities. Our work in this space was significantly amplified during the height of COVID, when many small businesses really felt the pain and challenge of maintaining operations during a time of shutdown. Throughout this time, Rural LISC worked to strengthen our business development organizational network, providing immediate relief to small businesses through direct loans, grants, and technical assistance. We learned through this process that business development organizations, or BDOs, are critical infrastructure in regional rural economies, as they are often the only organizational entity providing direct technical support to the variety of small businesses and micro businesses operating on our rural main streets and in our more remote areas. Today, we're here to listen to recent research regarding rural entrepreneurial ecosystems and to dialogue on models and best practices. All of today's event was made possible by the generosity and support of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And it is my honor to introduce Katrina Badger, who's a program officer for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who is specifically focused on helping entities like Rural LISC build equitable and sustainable rural regional economies. So with that, Katrina, the platform is yours.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I wanted to first give a little bit of context about the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, particularly the team I sit on, and how this project fits with what we're doing. So the Healthy Communities team, where I sit at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, aims to create the conditions in communities that enable everyone to reach their best possible health and well-being. We recognize equitable community development and economic development as really important ways to creating those conditions. And several years ago, we took on a learning journey to better understand rural considerations for our work across the country. One of our top findings from that learning journey was this hypothesis that rural-urban regional development offers an enormous and actually largely untapped solution. And we wanted to learn more, but also to actually generate and support efforts that are already going on across the country to advance that sort of approach. So as part of that effort, we funded a cluster of grants, including this one to Rural LISC, to really push the learning edge and the practice among those leading this thinking in the field. And at the time, based on Rural LISC's deep experience and insight from their work across the country, and repeatedly seeing challenges around sustainability and meaningful impact related to hyperlocal approaches, they were really seeking to understand practically how to implement a rural-urban regional approach to equitable development that could provide a new model to be adopted by not just themselves, but others across the field trying to advance equitable development across the country. At the time, we were imagining that this may lead to opportunities for LISC and Rural LISC to collaborate and align their networks and efforts as not previously done before. We imagined that it might provide catalytic insight and inspiration for others in the field as well. And let's see, I think the insights from the project as it has evolved over time are great contributions to the field. Really excited about the practicality of it. While a lot of insights can feel very academic and researchy or theoretical, I feel like this set of work helps us get to how we can actually do our work differently. So I'm excited to now turn it over to Robin to share some of the specifics. Thanks so much.
Great. And now to kick us off in the conversation is Robin Barnes, who's the Senior Advisor at Julep Consulting. Robin has over 3 decades experience in small business and resilience planning. Her work truly stems from New York State to Louisiana. I actually met Robin immediately after Hurricane Katrina when we spent years together working in the economic development space to really address post-disaster impacts on small businesses. Robin's work focuses on the role of the entrepreneurial ecosystem as a driver of key economic growth. She's here with us today to really lay the foundation of her work and to set up the framework for today's moderated panel. So with that, Robin, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you, Katrina. I'm delighted to be here today. I wanted to just also a little bit of housekeeping. If you all would put your questions in the chat as I move forward through my presentation, as we move forward to the panel discussion, and we will get to all of your questions, we promise. If we can't answer them all today, we will definitely answer them moving forward. But again, delighted to be here. Katrina spoke to the practicality of this study, and I'm a practitioner. I'm not actually a researcher. And so, my way of doing research is to go out and talk to the people who are doing the work, as well as read the research that others better equipped than I have done. And so, what we looked at was sort of figuring out, well, what exactly is sort of needed to help move all of this forward. And we recognize that there is a plethora of thoughtful research on rural communities, small businesses, and economic development. And so this study is more practitioner focused, and it develops an analysis and recommendations that promote the intersecting roles of small businesses and strong business ecosystems. So these recommendations that we'll be talking about today apply relevant research and practices to strategies and tactics that can best be promoted by Rural LISC, other CDFIs, and others in the field of economic resilience. Next slide, please. Our research framework suggests that a healthy regional economy consists of a multitude of components and actors, and these components are interconnected, each one a lever in building a healthy economy and community. And we're talking about private sector, public sector, nonprofits, financing, et cetera. The connection of small businesses and BIPOC businesses in particular to the components of a strong regional economy is underexplored. And the pandemic has changed everything, and climate change is not helping. Next slide, please. So what were our key assumptions? Our key assumptions going into this study is that small businesses are harbingers of economic challenges. Frequently, they're the canary in the coal mine. They feel the effects of change in customer and client behavior and spending patterns, sometimes before the community and the broader economy feels them. So they know what's going on. Furthermore, they are susceptible to structural racism. Historically, BIPOC small businesses have not had easy access to opportunities and have not had the capacity sometimes to enjoy economic development incentives, as well as access to capital and trained workforces. In the best of circumstances, small businesses often lack adaptive business management strategies and are not always quick to be able to pivot. Which of course is now a new value core business competency that we all know a lot about. Studying disasters reveals the central role small businesses play in revitalizing communities. And they provide critical services and products, and they're employers of community members, therefore critical after a disaster. The global pandemic has underscored economic interconnectivity and highlighted the importance of small businesses as central to a community's economic strength. We heard a lot from our small businesses during the pandemic, and furthermore, has connected public and community health to economic security. And such learnings can be applied and noted outside of a disaster recovery context. When I speak about economic resilience, I'm basically describing a community's ability to foresee, adapt to, and leverage changing conditions to their advantage. That was a definition that came from the National Association of Counties. When we're talking about small businesses here, we don't define small businesses specifically by number of employees or specific business type. However, in conversations with interviewees and through the majority of the research, we held the assumption that small businesses we were targeting were some of the smallest, perhaps under 20 employees, including sole proprietors, home-based businesses, and non-employer businesses. So that gives you the context. Next slide, please. A little more background on small businesses. We believe there's a case to be made for how small businesses can contribute to the competitiveness of regions and why they therefore should be integrated into broader economic development efforts. Small businesses provide critical services. They supply major industries, they generate tax revenue, provide services to the economy. 2, they promote quality of life, culture, and neighborhood amenities. All of those things are extremely important to economic development. Small businesses increase equity and inclusion. Nearly 1/3 are owned by women and nearly 1/4 are owned by minorities, positioning the growth of small businesses as a strategy for achieving regional BIPOC goals and increasing BIPOC wealth. Small businesses employ the most at-risk workforce, including the disabled and less educated, with the potential to help vulnerable populations become job ready. They've generated over 64% of net new jobs over the past many years, and they make up the majority of jobs for rural residents. However, outside of densely populated urban environs, in small cities and in rural communities, connections that urban small businesses may have to regional economic development strategies become diffused, and the conversation becomes hyperlocal. Next slide, please. So now we move on to our analysis and recommendations. Next slide, please. So in our analysis, we looked to what other researchers have concluded. We did our homework. We looked at what practitioners are doing at some best practices, and we delved into a case study. Next slide, please. Here's what we learned from the analysis, from the literature reviews and interviews with researchers. We learned that there are key ingredients that researchers have suggested that are important to the economic health of small cities and rural communities. One is a tangible investment in regional resilience. And what we mean by that is broadband, workforce, affordable housing, transportation, education, healthcare. We need investments in all of those things. The second is regional economic connectivity. This sets the stage for small businesses in small cities and rural communities to thrive, because the small businesses will have access to broader supply chains, procurement opportunities, maximizing market opportunities, et cetera. A greater integration of the small business ecosystem into the economic development ecosystem. Each would mutually benefit. Cohesive regional, multiracial economic ecosystems that are well-resourced with organizational capacity, available capital, and incentives. Equitable and inclusive practices that enhance small businesses' access to capital, business, and economic development, and making sure that these are deliberate and intentional and not afterthoughts. And maximizing opportunities created by disasters. Disasters are devastating to communities, but they offer opportunities for a reset. Communities that have experienced disasters are often ripe for economic resilience work, and small businesses stand to benefit. Next slide, please. After looking at the research, we looked at some best practices. And again, we're going to hear a lot more about best practices from our 4 wonderful panelists following my presentation. So I'm only going to speak to a couple here today. And then there's actually more information available in this full report, which will be available following this presentation. So the first example that I wanted to use is very close to my heart. It's focused on Hurricane Katrina recovery program, where the state, using federal disaster recovery, CDBG disaster recovery funding, created a small business recovery grant program. That grant program provided loans, grants, and technical assistance, not only to get businesses back open, but also to professionalize operations, upgrade equipment and technology, and enhance connections to distribution markets. One of the industries that was really hard pressed to be able to take advantage of these programs was the fishing industry. And a lot of the fishermen in Louisiana have language barriers. They're Asian businesses, they have not really relied on financial institutions and kind of those sort of connections. And so it was really challenging, and it prompted a great deal of partnership to be able to work in these communities and to be able to really understand how to partner with these communities. The outcome was a real focus now on how to help fisheries adapt here in Louisiana. For a while, there was something called the Southeast Louisiana Fisheries Assistance Center, but now there are a number of organizations that are very focused on working with fishermen, and not only with working on the actual fishermen, but looking at the entire supply chain of the fishing industry. And so it's sort of an example of how a disaster recovery program has now turned into actually ongoing assistance. A second example is the Virginia Economic Development Rural Think Tank. This is an example of a state economic development agency valuing rural assets and prioritizing local input. And the agency identified through their rural think tank high impact interdependent initiatives that support job creation, things like broadband, things like marketing, getting business ready site inventory, customized resource workforce development program. The relevance to small businesses here is that with enhanced economic development, small businesses will prosper if there are new procurement and business opportunities, new populations that will patronize small businesses, and capital investment in infrastructure that will serve large and small businesses. But another key learning here was how the agency is partnering with the rural communities and engaging the rural communities in this work. Next slide, please. Lastly, we looked at a case study. We actually looked at Northwest Ohio, and one of our panelists here today is Kim Kutcher, who's with LISC Toledo office. And you're going to hear in more detail from her, but Rural LISC has a strong and synergistic relationship with National LISC Toledo office, with the urban office. And in collaboration with this office, with Kim Kutcher, we met with stakeholders representing economic development, academia, community organizations, civic leadership, and elected officials. And so this was really looking at how does a region approach economic resilience and small business assistance. So as we met with stakeholders during 3 workshops back in 2021, we heard from them what they viewed the factors were for some economic decline in that region in Northwest Ohio. One of the things that they talked about was limited placemaking and connectivity, the need to define more unique spaces to help with community engagement and help community economic development flourish. Underinvestment. The region suffers from a history of underinvestment across the board, and that's ranging from housing, broadband, nonprofit capacity, et cetera. A lack of coordination. There was an overwhelming sentiment from stakeholders that rising tides lift all boats, and that there are ways to share resources and stop competing against ourselves. Absence of a culture of entrepreneurialism in the region. I thought this was particularly interesting because it was talked about as a culture and ethos, and not just having the supports in place, but having the desire for it. And also a lack of access to capital and banking services. Next slide, please. The overarching sentiment we heard was about amplifying the impact of the regional economy and strengthening all from within the region by supporting each other. And this really spoke to a desire to consider a regional approach for local challenges, to consider that urban-rural connection and make that real. Next slide, please. Again, we heard from the stakeholders, the same ones that helped us understand some of the challenges. We heard them in terms of the solutions, and they came up with ideas around arts and events and placemaking. And these were ideas that they've been thinking about for a long time. Small business supports, more worker supports, more regional coordination, more strategy setting, more alignment between the private sector, the public sector, and the colleges. And also looking for ways to capitalize on federal money coming down for infrastructure. And I'll let Kim talk more about what is happening now. But these were some of the things that came out of our focus groups. Finally, I wanted to talk about recommendations. Next slide, please. Economic development practitioners work at many levels and represent different types of authority, resources, influence, and advocacy. From government officials to local and regional economic development leaders, business development organizations, community-based financial institutions, the following recommendations support collaboration and coordination of these various practitioners as they strive to improve small business and economic resilience in rural communities and small cities. Okay, next slide, and we'll go to the recommendations. The first recommendation is to connect small cities and rural communities to regional economic development strategies so as to help build rural assets and enhance local capacity and opportunity for small businesses. And so as a practitioner, I really wanted to look at, well, who would be involved with that? And so this is looking to partnership between rural organizations, BDOs and such, and regional economic development organizations or state economic development agencies. What are the outcomes potentially? Small businesses and communities would benefit from the intel and actions of EDOs who have a lot of knowledge about market trends, business attraction, supply chain and procurement opportunities. EDOs would be influenced by small businesses and communities. And also have some help with local sourcing, procurement, quality of life, et cetera. Secondly, create regional and business supply chain investment and technical assistance opportunities. And this is really looking at what are the major industries, which might include larger employers, but looking at how can small businesses connect to that. What are the supply and value chain opportunities to connect? So when I talked about this a little bit before with the commercial fishing industry, the fishermen themselves rely on the docks, the marinas, the processors, the distributors, the retailers. And so finding ways to invest in that supply chain can really help bolster communities and bolster opportunities for small businesses. Next slide, please. Acknowledging hyperlocal and regional equity and inclusion. And so here we're talking about the fact that BIPOC is interpreted differently in and between small cities, rural communities, and economic regions. So diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions should start with education awareness about who lives and works in these communities, what are their unique and collective assets, challenges, goals, and roles. Recommended partners here might be philanthropy, research and educational institutions, community organizations. However, DEIJ organizations should not be relegated to doing all the work. Absolutely, BIPOC-led organizations and businesses should lead and inform, but the broader community should be approached. These should become community goals with broad engagement to be able to address equity and inclusion challenges. Another recommendation is investing in rural and cultural entrepreneurs. So the idea here is that communities benefit from producing products and solving social problems and or focusing on reimagining social roles and motivating new behaviors. And local talent and vision would be motivated and incentivized to use business models to promote equity in placemaking. New and permanent jobs might be created that would mitigate migration from rural to urban areas. And we would find a way to keep young entrepreneurs engaged with the goal of retaining population. And involved in this would be CDFIs, organizations like RCAP, organizations like LISC, Kauffman Foundation, potentially funds entrepreneurship, and historically Black colleges and universities. Next slide. There are some additional recommendations. I'm not going to go into all of that detail here, but some things that really came out were supporting more business adaptation. We talked about that a little bit before, supporting the pivot, building local capacity for inclusive marketing and placemaking, communications. Marketing was something we heard about a lot from business development organizations, from businesses and such. And so we wanted to point that out. Looking to relationships with national associations that influence procurement, capital access, and other issues that are relevant to equity and rural needs, and facilitating leadership in the next generation of civic and public leaderships to keep those people from leaving communities. Finally, we want it, next slide, please. I just wanted to end this by saying there's always more work to be done. And we wanted to point out a couple of areas. One is looking at equity in the rural context, looking at that analysis, looking at who is working and living in these places and defining what equity goals are from community to community. A second need for analysis is to look at public resources and support for small businesses at the state and regional level. We see mostly that there's resources available at the very local level for small businesses, and not so much at the state and regional level, and having more state involvement and state having strategies for small businesses might have some great impacts. And I mentioned earlier, regional supply chain analyses, looking at what are the opportunities for small businesses to tap into the industries that are dominating the rural communities that they're in, and how can they connect to those. So those were our recommendations for today, and we hope that this sets a foundation for the discussion with the panelists that's going to follow. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kate.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you for your research and for truly illustrating that small businesses are really the backbone of so many of our rural communities, but are often being left out of the regional economic dialogue, especially as it relates to DIJ issues. So great research. Again, we're still very much at the beginning stages of a very long journey when it comes to the level and the need for small business investment in our rural areas. But if you have any questions for Robin and or her research, please don't hesitate to throw those questions into the chat. We're also happy to make some connections after the presentation. But with us here now to discuss the various models of growth that Robin had alluded to earlier in her presentation is Maurice Jones. For those of you who are not familiar with Maurice Jones, you'll often find him running through an airport like he is today, but he's actually the current CEO of 110, which is an organization that seeks to connect Black talent with high-paying jobs in corporate America. Previous to this position, Maurice was also the former president and CEO of LISC, the former deputy secretary of HUD, and the former secretary of commerce for the state of Virginia. But most importantly, Maurice is a believer in the power of small businesses to create and foster equity, wealth, and opportunity in rural communities. Maurice, welcome. Thank you so much for serving as moderator, and the platform is yours.
Thanks, Kate. And good afternoon to everybody. Maybe good morning to some, depending on where you are in the country. I'm in the airport in Charlotte, so that's where I am and will be for this conversation. So bear with me. You may hear some announcements in the background. And if you see me taking off, it means they moved my flight up. But I think we're going to be all right. I'm excited about this conversation. And so I'm going to get right into it. I want to thank Rural LISC for the incredible work that you've done now for a generation plus, and for the work that you're going to be doing, all of the Rural LISC partners and everybody who's involved with small businesses and with rural growth. We need both to continue to grow and to prosper in order to sustain excellence in our country. Let me introduce our panelists to start with. I want to first introduce Kim Koocher, who is not just a panelist, but is someone I admire and consider a friend. And delighted to be with you, Kim. She's got a promotion since I left LISC. She's the program VP for the Midwest and the interim program executive director for LISC Toledo. So Kim, welcome. Our second panelist is Don Macke. Don is the Senior Vice President for, and I hope I'm articulating this right, E2 Entrepreneurial Systems, right? I remember it was the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship, right? So Don, good to see you. Good to have you with us. Our third panelist is Mark Watson. Mark is the co-founder and president of Potlikker Capital. Mark is, there you go. Good to see you, my friend, and welcome. And then our final panelist is Adam Zimmerman, who is the CEO of Craft 3. And I can't see Adam on my, there he is. Okay. All right, I'm good. I'm doing this from an iPad. So let me ask our panelists to elaborate a bit on this very brief introduction. Thank you all for being with us. Looking forward to this conversation. And let me just start with Kim. I'd love for you all to say more about your organizations, your mission, vision, and the impacts in particular that you aspire to with respect to small businesses and rural communities. About 3 or 4 minutes each. And Kim, I'll ask you to kick us off, if you will.
Well, good to see you, Maurice, and good to be joining everyone here today. My name is Kim Koocher, and I'm the Program Vice President for the Midwest and Interim Executive Director for the Toledo office. And for over 20 years, including the over 10 years I've been at LISC, I've worked to strengthen both people and place-based strategies, focusing on economic development, including small business, workforce, and housing. Through a number of different tools that LISC has had, we've been able to work with regional partners that span institutions, both in the healthcare sector, as well as universities, museum, metro parks, and other organizations that are working to connect the business development organizations to small businesses in our community so that we can provide the right supports to provide great places for people, whether it be in the urban center or our surrounding rural communities, for people to have access to equitable and inclusive opportunities. So I'm excited to be with everyone today and dig into this conversation a little more deeper.
Terrific. Thanks, Kim. Don, why don't you go next, if you will?
You bet. Thanks, Maurice. As Maurice indicated, E2, which stands for Entrepreneurial Ecosystems, it's now hosted by Network Kansas, and you're absolutely right. For the past 40 years, it's been the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship, and we primarily do rural ecosystem building, and that would include everything from small metros like Missoula and Bozeman in Montana to very rural landscapes throughout North America. And currently we've got some really neat projects underway in Oregon, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Kansas. So thanks for having me today.
Thanks for being with us. I appreciate it. Mark, you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Maurice, and thank you for the invitation today. I'm Mark Watson, and I co-founded Potlikker Capital. And for those of you who are not familiar with what Potlikker is, it's the juice when you make collard greens at the bottom of the pot. And it's really a perfect metaphor for what we provide. Potlikker is an integrated resource company, and we provide reparative capital, which is a blend of knowledge, social, and low interest or negative interest capital to support BIPOC farmers nationally to be the leaders in stewarding the regeneration of their communities. And that is a lot to say, but it's also an acknowledgement that often sort of these broad brush strategies for certain communities don't work for BIPOC communities. Because the reason why we offer reparative capital is first to acknowledge the damage to those communities, and secondly, to repair that. And that looks different whether you're talking about an indigenous community, an African-American community, or a Latino community. And so that is our focus. We invest in clusters. I love Robin's preface to this, that essentially is our deployment strategy, where we're building capacity among the local residents to be the engineers of economic and health in their communities. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for your work. And last but certainly not least, Adam, why don't you tell us more about what you're doing and impacts, etc.
Sure. Thanks, Maurice. And Zimmerman, I'm used to going last. So Craft 3 is the nonprofit CDFI that I'm the CEO of. It's about 27 years old. I think for the purposes of this conversation, what's maybe interesting about us or somewhat unique is that the footprint of Craft 3 is 2 states, Oregon and Washington. So we consider ourselves a regional institution. And we work in both kind of the big metros, so Portland Metro and Seattle Metro, as well as we have offices in places that many of you have never heard of, places like Walla Walla and Astoria. What that means for our work and our programming, which is largely business lending and community facilities, nonprofit lending, is that we see entrepreneurs working in urban communities and we see them working in very rural places. And the challenges are different and the same. And for our history, we've tried hard to take learnings from both places and make them transferable, both our own and information that we can share with our borrowers and our partners in those different places. So it makes for an interesting perspective. We also work in 2 states, and I know Robin talked a little bit about the challenges of support in different communities that come from different levels of government, and we certainly see that working across 2 very distinct state platforms for supporting entrepreneurism. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us. And I'm going to stick with you because I want to put the last first now, right? So the Z go first. I'm going to try to ask you all individually some questions that are customized to you, and then we'll do some group questions, if you will. And Adam, I'll stick with you. Well, one of the things I noticed and what I read about you was your development of this triple bottom line collaboration and scorecard. Can you talk about that and how and more generally? I know your focus on metrics is something that you've been pushing to make sure we are looking at more than just transactions, but elaborate for us, if you will.
Sure. Over the course of our 27-year history, the organization started with a focus on rural and also on how the economies of Oregon and Washington, the rural economies were changing. When I was in college in the 90s, for example, we were still fighting over trees. That's less true now. But as that happened, rural communities were really struggling with how to sort of evolve from being, frankly, a resource colony for the rest of the country into something else. And that's ongoing. There's a lot of sad and some happy stories about that. But when we were talking about how to do that, part of it was how do you measure prosperity, but how do you measure ecosystem integrity and how do you measure social system integrity? So that's, Maurice, that's kind of where the triple bottom line work came from. And a lot of our rural practitioner friends around the country had different versions of this, whether it was CEI in Maine or NCIF, National Capital Investment Fund in kind of Central Appalachia. I think now we've evolved quite a bit to put a more pointed approach to it, which is our communities in terms of climate are in crisis. We're talking a lot about climate adaptation right now for businesses and households. We're talking about the strength of small business and everything that Robin's talking about, which is how do you bolster a small business? I feel like the word ecosystem is overused, but how do you bolster that? Because they are, what did you say, Robin, the canary in the coal mine, in many ways in the communities that we work in. And then we're talking about community essential services and resilience. How do the institutions that help us all, how do they survive and thrive? How do they get what they need? So we're evolving it, Maurice, I'd say, because the world is changing, right? It's good to talk about. I can certainly talk about more, but I'll stop there.
Well, let me follow up on that. How has, frankly, the journey through COVID led to any evolution, if you will?
It is important that you keep a close
what we saw, we as many CDFIs did kind of rush to the support of small businesses. So we did a lot of work with rural governments who had the opportunity to give away money to just help their small businesses tread water. That was hard work for everyone. No one had the capacity, ready to handle a pandemic, right? It just didn't exist. We all did it. I hope that, and I think that the regional governments and the local governments that we worked with on that have learned how important it is to not be caught. And I wouldn't say they were caught flat-footed, they just didn't have the capacity, and to think a little bit more about whether it's a pandemic or a natural disaster or an economic disaster, how to be ready to support those small businesses. Because I don't have the data, but we gave grants to, it was a ridiculous amount of business. It was like thousands of businesses. It was a lot through our partnerships. And I don't have the data to know, and I don't know if anyone does, but some of them didn't survive, and there were lots that didn't get grants. And those are, I think, what we continue to talk about is they're so important to all of these communities. They're not only economic drivers and employers, but they're leaders. And when they take a hit, their ability to lead, their capacity to lead, their capacity to engage at the community level goes away because they're busy nursing their own wounds, right? They're figuring it out. And we communities can't survive that over and over again. I'm sure there's lots of examples where they haven't.
I appreciate that for sure. Mark, let me turn to you. I understand you have been or are involved in some work in Camden, and the Camden example, if you will, has some lessons to teach us regarding creating intentionality when it comes to focusing on small business. I wonder if you could elaborate on that work and lessons learned regarding this kind of absolute need for the intentionality.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. And I just want the audience to know I've had the privilege of setting up 4 different economic development funds, more than 100 small businesses across different sectors, and the Boston Impact Initiative, which was an unregulated entity. I was managing director of Fair Food and also helped redesign Michigan Good Food Fund, and now Camden, and then Potlikker is my latest. And I say that because this has been a learning journey for me. And one of the mistakes I think we as financial intermediaries have been making, from my own perspective and from Potlikker's perspective, is that we lend against our own priorities and not necessarily look at the community's priorities. And there need to be mechanisms that make those priorities. And when I say community, I don't mean it excludes the institutions. I mean all the stakeholders in a place. There needs to be some opportunity to see visibly the priorities of the community. And Camden, New Jersey is a project that Campbell Soup basically funded the backbone of setting up together with New Jersey, South Jersey Community Foundation to establish that very platform to make visible the priorities. So for example, in this case, it's within a food context. But if the majority of dollars are to be deployed locally, and the majority of entrepreneurs locally, they are first-time entrepreneurs, it has many implications around the type of resources that need to be brought there. There's low, indigenous equity, right? Maybe there are farm team approaches from institutional buyers who want to bring opportunities to that community. So I say that because I think the way of the future, and Potlikker's that way, we are a farmer-led board and a farmer-led investment committee. Not a lot of people like me. And that was intentional because we're trying to get to the priorities of those situations. And then we use our social capital, as those on this call, to make those priorities manifest. And that's how we feel we're in simpatico with the community and not necessarily lending through our own agendas, which may oftentimes have unexpected consequences or actually be counter to the interests of that local community. That's particularly acute in rural contexts.
Yep. We all need to learn that lesson across a number of different spaces, by the way. So thanks for sharing that. Don, let me go to you next. I'm curious about pandemic lessons for actually building and sustaining a small business ecosystem. What has the pandemic taught us in your eyes when it comes to what it takes and the importance of building an ecosystem for small business development and for rural development, frankly, for that matter?
Yeah, Maurice, I think I want to reflect on a 50-year case study that we've been doing with the Kauffman Foundation of a community called Ord, Nebraska. It's a community of 2,000 farm and ranch dependent, pretty traditional community if you look at the Central Great Plains. And it just happened that we had already completed really detailed interviews with a whole set of entrepreneurs and community leaders pre-pandemic. And so when the pandemic hit, a colleague of mine, Dr. David Iaquinta, reconnected with folks and was able to generate some really detailed insight, not only around how those small business owners responded, how the community worked with them, but also how the community's entrepreneurial ecosystem really geared up, and not only the ecosystem, but the healthcare system. And so let me illustrate. I think there's three things. One, this community very quickly energized its support of each other. And this was particularly true with entrepreneurs helping other entrepreneurs work through issues like, I've got to lay off people. I just lost my distributor. The list goes on and on. Part of it was resources. And I think in that particular case, two resources really stood out. One is the community already had in their ecosystem robust capital access, 5 banks that had a working relationship with gap financing, LLC investor groups, and very quickly they were able to help businesses recapitalize given the challenges and also given the delays in aid. And on the other front, the community healthcare system quickly recognized that from the schools to these business owners, there were going to be mental health issues. And they quickly expanded their mental health services. They reached out, they put testimonials out there to say, hey, rural folks, it's okay. If you're feeling really stressed, reach out and we can help you. And I think one of the stories that's particularly telling is a young entrepreneur in his 40s, Caleb Pollard, had a very successful brewing company, really got hammered. And Caleb has been willing to share his story of how the ecosystem and his neighbors and peers helped him, but also the fact that he reached out for mental health services that really kind of brought him back from the edge, and in turn reached out to his friends and family and others and said, hey, dude, there's no downside to getting mental health help in an environment like this. And he made it possible for others to do that. So I think stories like this really help us understand that the system needs to respond very quickly, very intuitively. There has to be relationships where that's in place, like in a community like Ord. Those responses were almost instantaneous, which meant the negative outcomes of the pandemic, not only on business, but people's lives, were far less reduced when we compare them to other like communities that did not have that kind of ecosystem, Maurice.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And finally, Kim, let me bring you in. I know you've been doing a fair amount of work and continue to do a fair amount of work regarding trying to create, how best to put it, a connections, collaboration between rural, urban, regional economies. I wonder if you have any lessons to share for us regarding best practices that actually work to sustain an urban, rural economic development agenda.
Well, I think, much of what we've learned sort of reflect a lot of what people's comments have been about, the pandemic really forced many organizations and institutions to work together differently. So prior to the pandemic, many people, would talk about the siloing nature of lots of our works. And I don't think that sort of is just focused on whether we're talking about CDFIs or economic development agencies. All types of organizations talk about siloing, but the response that so many of us had, because our intentions were to be responsive to communities, allowed us to work together in different ways and be quick and maybe establish connectivity that we did not have prior to the pandemic. And that really allowed us to do some learning about each other, because so often part of the ability to harness the infrastructure that exists to support small businesses requires people to have an awareness of what each other does and how you could even work with the existing infrastructure that's there, and then identify gaps to support more BIPOC or women or veterans and in supporting their businesses. But if we don't know what each other does, it's really hard to sort of understand that. And I think the pandemic allowed for more connection to happen than existed previously. So I think that it's unfortunate that we had to go through the pandemic to learn that, but we now have really sort of moved in a direction working with Bowling Green State University. They have received some dollars through the USEDA and as part of our SEDS plan of figuring out what are those things that are transactional that, maybe we need to do at some level, but how is it that we establish strategic coordination among each other that creates for transformation? And so all of us had to move a lot of resources and are continuing to move a lot of resources and deploy those resources so we can be most responsive. But if we're only talking about grants or capital on the transaction side and not looking at the systems, particularly those systems that have prohibited inclusive growth, we are just going to experience these same things over and over and over again and not change that result. So we have been working with the institutions, the universities, and some of the regional economic development agencies to better change some of those systems by focusing and working together on small business, but also on some of the workforce issues, and working with the urban and rural LISC network to support some of those transformational types of strategies.
Let me pick up on this theme of inclusion. I knew this was going to happen. I knew they were going to announce when I came on. But let me pick up on this theme of inclusion and throw this open for all of our panelists. Talk to us about what we need to make sure we are doing, or maybe let me phrase it another way. What are the lessons regarding best practices to ensure that BIPOC-led businesses are at the table, have power, have voice, are getting their share of resources, are part of the ecosystem, are in the mainstream? anybody who wants to kick us off, I throw that out to all of you all. What are the lessons learned? What are the best practices? Who's doing it well? However you want to approach that question.
So Maurice, I would throw in for the conversation that we kind of need to stretch our definitions a little bit. Obviously with BIPOC, there are historical issues, no question. But as we look at rural communities, there is a much more expansive group of individuals in our communities who are either underserved because they're not on somebody's radar screen, and so they're not participating in these systems, or worse yet, they're marginalized by intentionality, they're excluded. And so we find that it could be young people, new residents, particularly veterans, disabled persons, regardless of race and ethnicity, that oftentimes are on the margins of these communities. And I think that's where the system has to really look at itself and say, do we understand who lives in our community and who's actually benefiting in the economy? Who owns and runs small businesses in our community? And if that only represents a small slice of that community, then I think the community has to challenge itself and say, why don't we have any 20-year-olds that are starting and buying businesses? Or maybe we've got all of these veterans back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and they've not been able to get bank loans. Well, why is that the case? And that reflection we find to be really important in a community to really take stock is everybody in our community having the opportunity to participate in the economy. Oftentimes those are hard discussions, but they're really powerful when a community then says, okay, we're going to find ways to create pathways for the full diversity of our community to participate in finance, technical assistance, but also feel like they have the agency that they can go and pursue buying or starting a business.
Maurice, I'll add with perhaps a different take, Don.
That's what I'm looking for. Jump in.
And I say this because we're in this context, I'm talking about agriculture, and we have, well, all smallholder farmers are under pressure from corporatization of the food system. We know that Black farmers have, we're down to less than 45,000 after being at 1 million. And all, quote, socially disadvantaged farmers are together only 4% of our nation's production. So so that requires it requires particular attention to address it. And so what we are learning, and it is a learning journey, I certainly don't have all the answers, is this program started off talking about resiliency. And so we've been trying to define what is that? How do you actually create the conditions for resiliency? And what we're trying to target, and we're actually going to measure, and I'm happy to talk about that, is relationships. The more successful farmers, the farmers in this case who are able to adapt to climate change, fires, crop disasters, lack of labor, commodity spirals, et cetera, whatever those issues are folks who have options. And so when we look at BIPOC farmers, they have many less options, and the options they have are often more expensive or not transparent. So what we're offering to do for BIPOC communities, and it is different for different populations. It would be different for those who are may have disabilities, et cetera, different from gender, different from indigenous, is to map the relationships they have at the point that we meet them through social mapping. To look at the depth and breadth of do they have financial options? Do they have soil remedial connections? Are they in relationship to the other farmers in their community? Do they have a distribution partner? Do they have processing access? All these things, tractors, access to that. So mapping that time one, and then time two, after several years of being engaged with us, what does that map look like? And then collecting narratives at time 1 and 2 to determine the quality of those relationships. What are their concerns at time 1 and what are they at time 2? And it's not that we can forecast the future, but at least if we're fortifying rural BIPOC communities with the tools to adapt, then there's a higher, possibility of them becoming resilient. And so that's what we're going to do, and move away from counting how many loans or how many, garlic cloves are being shipped to the latest food pantry or whatever. Fisheries, we work with Fisheries too. It's more about these relationships and the quality of them.
Very helpful. I appreciate both of those responses. Let me throw something out, and I want to get Kim and Adam in here. Let me throw out another question again for everybody, but Kim and Adam, I want to give you at least first dibs. Policy tools. Are there policy tools that you wish you had for your work that you don't have now, or that you wish you had more abundantly regarding the work that you're trying to do? And hopefully you can hear me over the announcement of that flight. I want to open that up to Adam and Kim to start with, at least.
I can start. I know that we've been looking at SSBCI, and certainly that is not a new initiative to support providing technical assistance to businesses, but some of the on the ground practice and policies and procedures of the program certainly provide lots of opportunities for CDFIs and intermediaries that have connections in communities, urban and rural, to be able to provide additional enhancements, either for business development organizations themselves or to be working with other technical assistance providers. But sometimes the policies that are in place in the various programs, so sometimes these tools are there, but it's how the tools are interpreted to be used that make it challenging for even partners that are sophisticated to really be able to deploy resources. So I think we as an organization certainly are challenging ways in which we can be more effective in Northwest Ohio and throughout the full LISC footprint. How is it that we can get after some of these existing programs, and what are some of the practice and procedures that make it difficult, or where these programs could work better, so that we could more effectively support businesses in the communities that we're working. So I think the SSBCI leaves a lot of opportunity, particularly when we're talking about small business, for that, and hope that we're able to better position ourselves to support more small businesses, particularly BIPOC women and veteran and under resource businesses.
Great. Adam, any thoughts on that?
A lot, but I don't know if any are terribly useful. I'll go back to say that we work in 2 different states, and so take SSBCI as an example. Like the states are approaching it completely differently, and one is very. I will just say I have a bias towards governments lending money directly to small businesses. I don't think it's a great idea in general. And I think there's other ways to do it with policy engagement. But so we have one state that's kind of on that train, and another that's, hey, we don't want to be in that business. We want friends and relationships to help us do that business. And so, I can complain about the fact that we have a federal system with state governments, but that's not really useful right now. I will say that, I do think, and I sort of touched on this before, one of the things that we are trying to do, and it gets back to your other question, is find ways to elevate the voices of the businesses in our orbit and the nonprofits, especially those that are historically disadvantaged, and those are mostly entrepreneurs of color for us. And so, our lending has increased across the board, and it's increased disproportionately to entrepreneurs of color, in part because of things that we went under the hood and changed a bunch of things in kind of traditional lending practice, if you will. And that's made a big difference, and our team said it would, and they were right. So that's been really good to see. But what we are focusing now on is, I think one of the, in even state government, certainly local government, one of the most effective voices for change is the small business owner that shows up and says, this is what I need in my community, because this is America and that street cred is unimpeachable at some level. And when a small business owner that's also a person of color shows up, I think that is a unusually powerful voice. And so we want to do what we can to elevate more of that. And I do think, I mean, you know, from a policy perspective, the more we support our friends and borrowers in that way at the state legislative level, asking for what they need, talking about what it's like out there for them to do what they do, whether they're a contractor or a restaurant or a real estate owner. I think that is exceedingly powerful in shaping what is ultimately a very difficult process at the state level. And you know, we see a lot of this money coming down from the federal government, which is, I think, helpful for a lot of us in this work, but it's being filtered in ways that are hard to track, and legislatures are not necessarily well equipped to understand how to program the money, and it's still happening, right? So, you know, I guess the policy piece I would say is more sharing about how our different practitioner folks are interacting at that level and helping the money get sort of distributed and get to where we can see on the ground with our folks that it needs to go. That is really good. So, you know, I'd say to LISC, like in general, like the more you all can share, like, hey, we did this in Ohio at the state level and it worked. That's helpful to us.
No, I appreciate that. Well, think about this one, and this is probably the last one, and then I'm gonna open it up for Q&A more generally to our audience. In the last 2 years now, small businesses have been asked to help keep the community healthy through various things. I wonder what the lessons are for us regarding how you ensure that you keep small businesses healthy while they're trying to keep the community healthy. Wonder if there's some lessons that you all could share on that question that we've learned now, particularly during this COVID season. And that's for everybody. Somebody jump in who wants to start.
I have a specific example of that, Maurice, of a small business in Detroit at the beginning of COVID that was close to going out of business and had support from some CDFIs previous to COVID. Making a long story short, that business was able to pivot almost within a quarter to provide meals to institutions, hospitals, and local residents that were healthy in a way that other institutions that were much larger were unable. The reason why they were able to do it is they were able to get quick capital that was very flexible. And now they have 2 stores, they're expanding, but it was one of the key players. It wasn't one of the large charities. It was a small individual who took out her 401k to start a small kitchen in Detroit. And now she's $1 million in revenues. And it happened only because of capital. The lesson learned is, so the pivot points, I think, is in a disaster often, we talk about resiliency, is the small business person. And that means we need to be more flexible to empower them to be the solution for restitution or reparations for that community. The other lesson is, and I'll get off my soapbox, is that we come to the market with prepackaged financial products. And we try to shove those down the throats of small businesses in the middle of a crisis. everybody else is adapting. And yes, we can provide grant dollars and, payment holidays and all the things we all did. But maybe there's some more creativity that we need to have in terms of like responding to a desire for the small business person to actually be part of the solution and not be part of the crisis. So that would be the lesson that we learned.
Who else? Anybody else want to chime in on this one?
Well, I think one of the things that we've observed, Maurice, is the power of small business owners and operators having relationships with each other. It's one thing to know somebody down the street, it's another to have a relationship with them. And what we've observed is where that kind of culture exists, these folks were helping each other. They were helping network outside resources. They were saying, yeah, the bank will refinance you, or you can get mental health services or what have you, or ideas on how to pivot. And communities where that culture was really strong, our observation was they tended to do better than communities that didn't. And I think that's a role of community economic development, is to create opportunities for these business owners to really build relationships with each other where it's okay to talk.
I think one of the points too I'd like to add, so many of us during the pandemic learned about flexibility and remote working, and that allowed us to connect with entrepreneurs at all times of the hour because we were adjusting our operations to meet the demands of the clients and communities in which we were working with, and especially at a time where we know that businesses need information quickly when they need it. Remote working offered that flexibility and provided that additional technical assistance where we know sometimes fintechs and things like that may be really appealing to entrepreneurs to get access to capital quickly, but it might not be the right capital. It may be expensive capital. No, if someone is not at the end of that application to talk about all of the other options or supports that might be provided. So I think that, moving forward, that, remote work and hybrid work, how is it that we keep the consumer, the client, the community, the small business person in mind, and take those learnings with us and operationalize them so that way we can be flexible and meet folks where they're at when they need it. Now, that might not mean 24 hours, but, could it be later in the evening when someone is finishing their business hours so that they could meet folks, at an 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock appointment? And certainly we did that during the pandemic. So there's maybe some ability for us to do that moving forward.
All good. I think I'm going to open this up now in the last 10 minutes and see if we've got any questions from our audience here, from our friends here. And I'm also going to ask Robin to join us for this Q&A piece as well. I am relying on Robin and or Tiffany. Did we get any questions in the chat that we want to pose to our panelists?
I'll jump in first, Robin, if you don't mind, and just ask folks if they hadn't already seen in the chat. There were questions about resources, and Katrina from Robert Wood Johnson posted a link for some more information, and I think Mark and Adam as well. So I appreciate that. We also did receive some questions in advance, so maybe we can start with that, and Robin, you can pick up with others. So there were a couple questions with regard to advocacy, and you talked about it a little bit, right? So small business owners who are looking to help stem the change for access to capital and placemaking and coordination, what would you say are the biggest tips? Like, what can somebody start doing tomorrow to help advance that population?
Tiffany, I can give an example. So I think part of the responsibility we have is to create demand for small business, as well as supply the capacity to serve the demand. And we were, so obviously we're focused on rural farmers, BIPOC farmers. We supplied data to a legislator in a particular state that procured product from farmers at price points that smallholder farmers could not meet. And a lot of this product went to food pantries and communities, and in this case, BIPOC communities. And so we supplied the economic development opportunity of broadening the criteria for procuring product from the state's rural farms, with a specific focus on BIPOC, smallholder and BIPOC. 70% of the farms in the state were smallholder farms. So here's a perfect dovetailing of a stream of revenues that was a governor line item that was now being written into the state annual budget. And we as an intermediate just contributed to the writing of the bill. The end of the story is the earmark was doubled and actually approved. And so now the state buys from smallholder farms. We wanted BIPOC specific earmark for BIPOC. We're working on that now. But that's like a very specific, real example of how leveraging advocacy and relationships we all have to create demand so that we can lend into demand that is sustainable.
Thanks, Mark. Kim, I think you had your hand up. Oh.
I was just applauding Mark's efforts.
And listen, just personally, Mark, I think it was you. I was taking notes, obviously, because this is great content, great session, everybody. You said something about that there's lending against our own priorities versus the community's priorities. And is that, similar to what you were just, your last response in terms of how do you influence that shift? And are there even enough, is there enough representation, right, when it comes to who's making the decisions about lending to small businesses?
I want to save space for other people to talk, but I'm just an example. So an example of that, when I was working in Boston, we deployed 30 loans, no credit checks, no tax return reviews. We lost no principal. We lost projected income, but we lost no principal, all Black and brown, high-risk communities. And it was illuminating because all of us spend a lot of time with algorithms, and well, I'm not saying that you don't need those things, but sometimes those have inherent biases that we don't completely understand that continue to propagate the issues that we're actually trying to solve together. So so the priority is to infuse disabled or women or people of color. As we were talking about, it's important to understand the historical context of how they got there. And maybe the tools that we normally use are not actually helpful in those environments. And so our lens may need to shift. And sometimes you need other people at the table to help us understand what parts of the lens need to change. And that's all I'm advocating is maybe some of the tools that have built our institutions are actually part of the things that are keeping other individuals from being part of our capitalist system.
Through gate E42.
Go ahead, Kim. I think you were going to jump in.
Yes, I was going to say, we often talk a lot at LISC about sort of both instigating change within systems that are continuing to perpetuate historic harms in our present and future sort of reality, while also having folks, businesses that are businesses of color, women, et cetera, at the table to be able to understand how we deploy capital now, because we can't, the systems are so complex and there's so many folks that need to be a part of influencing a different system so that the results are different than what exists today. But we also have to be responsive and figure out, as Mark, was talking, how we maybe deploy capital differently, but how we also are working with businesses to access more capital, which we can be responsive and provide more nimble capital to meet folks where they are. But if we know the next steps that they're going to need to take are private capital, and we're not getting folks on the path to do that and sort of understanding that at the same time we're working to change or create different systems. So we're working on both sides of the fence, which I think is important to create the type of change that we're seeking.
Adam, jump in here.
Thanks, Maurice. I just wanted to put in a plug for something that we did last year, which is, so like LISC, we were the fortunate recipients of a grant from Mackenzie Scott a couple years ago. And so we're still figuring out how to make full use of all that. And some of the things that we did were spend some money on things that we wouldn't normally have money to spend on. So last year, we hired a market research consultant, a company out of New York called Lightbeam, a small woman-owned consulting firm, to do a bunch of deep dives with businesses owned by people of color, to ask them how what we were talking about in terms of our offering did or did not work for them, how we were talking about it, what they saw, what they heard when we use certain words. And it was and I'd say in general, for us involved in community and economic development and lending, not just based on demographics, but in general, the way we talk about stuff hits some of those folks real cold. And it was a really powerful learning experience for us to start thinking about how we were saying what we were doing and what we wanted to do. And generally, they were aligned with what we were trying to do, what we cared about. Our values were aligned, but the language we were using was felt strange to them. So we're still working, we're still chewing on that, and it's different in different places, right? These were folks in the Northwest, even though, and it was all done virtually because life. But I would really advocate for that kind of listening for those of you who have the resources to pay for it. It was wonderful for us, and it, universal, like, right, that we had a particular focus on entrepreneurs of color because that's where we were trying to go with money. But to Don's point earlier, like, there are lots of community groups that are trying to or actors that are trying to get engaged, and maybe we're just not using the right kind of words sometimes.
So last question, and then I gotta let y'all go. Can you hear me? So the bold goal for small business growth development in the next 10 years, if you could pick one bold goal for us to rally around, you can only get one for the next 10 years with respect to small business development in rural America, what would it be? I'm going to start with you first, Don.
Well, I'm going to show my bias. Take some of the billions of dollars we spend each year on industrial attraction and business attraction incentives and redeploy that to support entrepreneurial ecosystem building, focusing on homegrown businesses.
I hear you on that one. I got plenty of stories for you on that one. Kim, your bold, audacious small business goal.
So much of where I sit in the Midwest is tied to advanced manufacturing. And I would really love to harness the entrepreneurial spirit and supply chain along I-75 interstate that would connect multiple states so that the supply chain is reflective of the businesses and people that live in the community. So create more connection between those small businesses and this advanced manufacturing engine that we have here in the Midwest.
Got you, Mark. Your bold, audacious goal for the next decade.
It's to somehow make economic development folks and policymakers aware that resiliency means you need rural as much as you need urban, and the interplay between the two. They are not two different islands.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Amen to that. Adam.
More real estate ownership by small business. I could put some numbers on it, but what we see is that's the pathway to generating wealth, and it's only going up, and we see businesses that can't get into that game as part of their portfolio, if you will, and that's got to change, and especially the disadvantaged ones that we all work with.
All right, I almost muted myself out. Okay, I'm going to turn this back to Kate, but before I do, I want to thank our panelists in a big way. I hope everybody will join me in doing that. And thank you for your great work that you all have been doing for a long time. With that, I'm going to throw it to Kate and say thanks to Rural LISC again for bringing us all together and for into the foundation as well.
Maurice, thank you so much. Go catch your plane. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again for serving as moderator for today's session. Panelists, Kim, Don, Mark, Adam, thank you so much. You had a wonderful dialogue. Really appreciated the bold, audacious goals. Really also appreciated the thoughts about what it's really going to take to knit together our rural entrepreneurial ecosystems in a very sustainable way, in a way that really goes the distance for generations to come on a multitude of fronts. So thank you again for all of your insights. Katrina and Robin, thank you also for the great amount of research that went into this and the organization of the panel. I think really the reflection of all the ideas that we listened to today is an embodiment of the amount of work that has really gone into our small business ecosystems and especially our BDO network. So thanks again for everything that you do to contribute to that. We are committed to continuing this dialogue. So we will be having additional dialogues on small business and entrepreneurship at our upcoming summit, December 6th to the 9th. At the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. So if you liked what you heard today, please continue to join us. We'll be talking a little bit more about knitting together entrepreneurial ecosystems, direct technical assistance to small businesses, types and models, what's working in rural communities, what's not, how can we lean in? And because we're in DC, we're talking about policies. So there's a lot going on with small businesses, particularly with the rollout of the IRA, that really tie in nicely to this topic and theme of resilience and adaptation and what we can do for our rural communities to really ensure that we're creating that pivot needed to really adapt and acclimate to the changing conditions that we're seeing climatically and also on the economic front. So with that, for any more information related to our programmatic work and upcoming summits, please visit us on our website at rurallisc.org. And if you have any other questions, also please feel free to reach out to us directly via email. We would love to hear from you. So thank you to all of our participants. Thank you to all of our panelists. Have a wonderful day. And Maurice, don't be late. Go catch the plane. Thanks, everyone.